In the last episode, when we extracted the getArticles function as a library, we simply relocated the function and didn't spend enough time thinking about the design of the library. As you can tell, the current API feels a bit amateur as we are exposing the implementation details and also offloading the responsibility of passing a well-formed URL with parameters to the end user, which is an overhead as a consumer of a crate. A good library should absorb and abstract the logic as much as possible from the end user. So in this episode, we'll go through cleaning up a few rough edges in NewsAPI and end up with a library that is more close to the existing client libraries for NewsAPI as shown here. Hey, welcome to another one. So today, let's spend some time improving the NewsAPI crate, and here are some of the changes we will do. First, we will define a top-level NewsAPI struct, which will have a bunch of methods. Essentially, we want our API to look something like this, where we have the new method, and we can pass the API key. Then we have the endpoint method that you can use to set the endpoint we want to request against. We can then also set the country, and finally we should be able to call fetch that will return us a list of news articles. So configuring the endpoint or the API key or the source country of the news will all be performed via method calls implemented over the NewsAPI struct. Then we'll hide the implementation details of the data types with the NewsAPI by removing the pub keyword in order to forbid introducing any breaking change if the underlying implementation changes. Instead, we will provide accessor methods for these data types. We'll also define a fetch method that will take all the configured params in the endpoint as part of the method calls and make a GET request to fetch the list of articles. We will also add support for handling and reporting errors described in the NewsAPI docs and club them together as part of the NewsAPI error that we defined before. We'll also make change to how the API key is passed as part of the HTTP request. At present, we are passing it as a query param, which may pose a security risk because often the request URLs can be sniffed as part of the server logs if the API server gets compromised. So instead, we'll pass the API key as an HTTP authorization header. And finally, we'll add a fetch async method that uses the request crate because we want our library to be used by not just sync users, but also any async project that uses the Tokio or async std runtimes. So to begin with, let's go back to our code editor. And with the NewsAPI under lib.rs, I'm going to start by defining the NewsAPI struct, which will have three fields. First is the API key, which is of type string. Then we have the endpoint field, which is of type endpoint. And this isn't defined yet, so let's define the endpoint type as an enum. And the only variant we will support as of now is top headlines. The third field we will add is the country, which is of type country. And this again is an enum. Let's add US to start with. So that's our NewsAPI defined. Next, we're going to add a few methods on NewsAPI. And to do that, we can use the impl keyword followed by the NewsAPI struct. And within braces, let's start by defining the new function that will return a NewsAPI instance. And within the body, we will create a NewsAPI instance, set the API key to the API key that gets passed as an argument. This is of type ampersand string, and in order to convert this into a string type, we will need to call the ToString method. For the endpoint, we'll initialize with top headlines, and for the country, let's initialize with US. And the last line in a function in Rust is implicitly returned, so we don't need to prefix it with a return keyword. And think of new as a constructor function, but you can have constructor functions by any name you want. New is just a convention that a lot of Rust projects use. Next, let's define a function called endpoint, which users can use to configure an endpoint for the request. And this will be a method. And to make it a method, the first parameter has to be a self. And since this method modifies the fields of the NewsAPI instance, we'll have to take a mutable reference to it. So once we have the self access, we can then set the endpoint method to the endpoint that gets passed as an argument. So let's add the endpoint that's going to come from the user. Then we will define a country method that also takes a mutable reference, and this also gets a country from the user, and we will do the same for country as well. And in order to let the users set the endpoint and the country, let's make the type definitions public. And additionally, let's make a small change to the endpoint and the country method so that we can chain the method calls like so. And in order for us to do that, we have to make a slight change to the return type and return a mutable reference to NewsAPI instance, and same for the country method as well. And this error is expected because we are not returning anything here. So let's return the self type, which is a mutable reference to NewsAPI. So I'm going to save this, and this should compile. So now that users can configure different parts of the URL, such as the endpoint and the country, let's add a method called prepare URL that will help us construct a URL at the time of calling fetch, which we'll also define in a moment. So this method returns a result of type string, and for stitching together different parts of the URL, we can definitely go with the raw string concatenation APIs, but doing so can introduce bugs. So instead, we'll use a crate called URL that has convenient URL parsing APIs and can also manipulate individual parts of the URL. So I'm going to go and import the URL crate, and we'll import the URL type. So to start with, we're going to define a mutable URL variable using the mute keyword, and we'll call the parse method, passing in something called a base URL, which we haven't defined yet. And the base URL is defined as a global constant using the const keyword, which has a type of string, and we'll grab this portion of the NewsAPI org endpoint and paste it in here. Now we have a couple of errors here, and this error has to do again with error composability. So to fix that, let's define a new error variant in NewsAPI error. Let's call it URL parsing. Let's add a description, and as the underlying error type, let's use the parse error type from the URL crate. And this time, instead of having to call map error to map the parse error type to a NewsAPI error, we can use a from annotation from the this error crate, and this will automatically do the conversion that we had to do manually here. So this fixes that, and this error is nothing but the compiler complaining us about having to return a proper error type. So since we haven't finished this method yet, let's add a to-do macro that will compile this method for the time being. So then we will need to append the top headlines path to the URL instance. So for that, we can call the path segments mute method, and this also returns a result type. But in this case, instead of having to call map error again or define a new error type, what we can do is simply call the unwrap method, which will extract the OK variant from the result type. But this method will fail in case there is an error variant. But since we know that we are parsing a proper URL here and the method cannot fail, and so it is fine to use unwrap here. So then we can chain a call to push and push the endpoint field from NewsAPI as a string by calling the ToString method. And this will take a reference to the string, so we'll prefix it with ampersand. And looks like we have another error here, and the error has something to do with the ToString method not existing for endpoint. And the compiler also provides us a hint of the endpoint not implementing something called ToString. And if you take a look at the documentation, the ToString is a trait defined in the stdstring module, which has the method ToString. So to fix this error, we'll have to implement the ToString trait for the endpoint type. And in order to do that, we can use the same impl keyword followed by the name of the trait we want to implement, followed by for keyword, and then the name of the type we are implementing the trait for. And within the braces, we will implement the members of the trait, which is ToString method. And within the body, we will match for the variant of endpoint, and if it's a top headlines variant, we will return the top headlines as a string. So match in Rust is an enhanced form of if-else where you can check for multiple conditions and act accordingly. So on the left side, you have the different possibilities that a type can match against, and onto the right, you simply perform the action you want to do. So that's our ToString trait implemented. So next we'll have to integrate the country query param. And the URL type also has a method called setQuery, which we can use to set the query param in the URL. And to this we'll pass a type called sum, which comes from the option type in Rust, and we'll pass in country, which we will define here, and we'll simply use the format macro to construct a query param string. And for the value of the query, we will use the country field's ToString representation. And ToString is also not implemented for country, so let's quickly define that. Okay, and there is another error, and for this we will simply need to prefix it with ampersand. So that's our query param set as well. So finally we will return the URL by converting it into a string, and remove this to do to make things compile once again. Now we're not going to add the API key as a query param as part of prepare URL, but instead as an authorization header when we create the HTTP request. So next, let's define fetch method, where we'll make the get request. So this is again a method, and this method will return a result type, and it will return a type called NewsAPI response. And in the body, let's first grab the URL by calling the prepare URL method and extract the URL as a string. Then let's create the HTTP request object using the urex get method. To this we will pass the URL. Then we'll use the set method to set the authorization header, and with self.api key as its value. And the NewsAPI response type is simply going to be the article struct renamed to that, and it will have a few additional fields: status, which is of type string, and code, which is going to be an optional string type. And let's remove this function since we don't need it now, and let's fix a few errors here. So that's our request object created. We can then get the response by invoking the call method on the request object. And while exploring the urec doc, I just noticed that urec comes with built-in support for converting responses to JSON. So we'll call the into JSON method and annotate it with the response that we want to parse into, in this case NewsAPI response. But into JSON won't work because we will need to enable the feature in urec. So I'm going to add in the JSON feature here, and this time things should work. And we again have the error composability issue, so this time we're going to update the request failed variant with the from annotation, and this should fix the issue. We'll do the same for the into JSON failure as well, and same for the stdio error variant as well, and this should fix most of our error composability issues. So with the response object in place, we will then use the match keyword. We'll check if the response succeeded, and to do that we'll match on the status of the response as a string, and if its value is okay, we will return an OK of response object, and for any other values which we assume to be an error, we will return an error and call a method called map response error, passing in the response.code field. This method isn't defined yet, so let's define that. This takes in the error code, which is an option of type string, and this maps the error message returned by the NewsAPI HTTP response to a NewsAPI error. So we'll first check if you have a value in the code field by using the iflet construct. In this case, the code type is an option of string, so one of the variants of option is the sum type, and so we are matching against that. And if that is the case, we will match on the code as a string, and we'll start filling in the error codes from the error docs. So let's post the first one to start things with, and for this we're going to return a NewsAPI error, and let's create a variant called bad request, and as its value we will put the error description, and we haven't defined this variant, so let's go ahead and create the error variant. We'll do bad request, and as its value we'll create a static string, and for the description let's put a quick description, and let's also print the message which we'll grab from the first element in the tuple. Now if you take a look at the error, the else part of the if pattern match is not being handled, so let's try to return the same error variant with our custom error message. And we have another error from match, which is a good thing when using the match expression, is that it enforces you to match with all possible cases for a given type. In this case, we have a string, so the match wants us to handle all other possible strings. For now, to keep things brief, I'm going to use a catch-all error. We can definitely fill the others later. So with that, our map response error implementation is complete. Let's remove the to-do macro from here, and this will finish our fetch implementation as well. So yeah, we have a first cut of the refactor done in NewsAPI. So let's take it for a spin in main.rs, and I'm gonna go back and within CLI news I'm gonna run bacon again just so we can fix the error in this one. So we're gonna remove these imports since they no longer exist, and then let's update the main function. So here let's try to use our newly created NewsAPI instance. So I'm gonna do NewsAPI, and I'm going to initialize it with the new function and pass in the API key. And we are getting an error for the usage of NewsAPI since we haven't exported it as a public API. So let's do that. I'm going to do pub here, and let's try to import NewsAPI, and then let's try to set the endpoint to be of endpoint.top headlines. And you can see that we still have errors when calling the new function because new is private as well. So let's make it public as well. And we also have an error in endpoint, which is again private. Let's make it public as well. Okay, so after that, we'll set the country to US, and let's make this public as well. So with the NewsAPI instance configured, let's remove this URL since all of that is going to be handled internally by the prepare call method. And let's retrieve the articles now by calling NewsAPI.fetch, and let's remove the older API. Let's make this public as well, and that fixes the error. So then we will have to pass a vector of articles to render articles because the function takes a reference to articles, which is a type from our older API. What we can do is we'll go back to lib.rs, and we'll implement a method for NewsAPI response that will give us access to the list of articles. So this is a method, and it returns a reference to vector of articles. So we can do self.articles, and we can put an ampersand there, and let's go back to main, and we'll have to change this to vector of article. Let's import article as well, and here we will call articles. Let's change this to a more descriptive name, NewsAPI response.articles, and let's remove this, and let's update the usage as well. And remember, we told about not providing direct access to fields of any data type from NewsAPI. So let's fix that. Let's go to the article struct. We will define accessor methods for both the fields. So we will do title, take self as reference, and we're going to return a reference to a string. So we can do self.title and return it as a reference. Same with URL, and let's make these public so we can call these, and let's remove the pub keyword from here. So with accessor methods implemented, we can then convert them into function invocation, and things should continue to work as before. Now there is an error with the NewsAPI declaration. The compiler says that we have to make this mutable, because if you take a look at the endpoint method, it takes a mutable reference to self. So we cannot call the method since it is not declared as. So the fix is simple. We'll just prefix it with mute, and it should work as before. So we are pretty much done here. So let's run CLI news once again. I'm going to do cargo run, setting the API key. Awesome. So the refactor works, but we're still not done with the NewsAPI refactor because we haven't added an async version of the fetch method. So in order to implement the fetch async method, we'll use the request crate behind a feature flag, which means that the fetch async method will be conditionally compiled only if the async feature is passed to cargo. So let's create the fetch async method. The signature is almost identical except for the async keyword. Within the body, we'll grab the URL as before. And then let's import the request crate. With the request crate imported, we will then create a client object by using the client's new method, and then create a new HTTP request by calling the client request method. In the method, we'll use get as the method, and we'll pass the URL. We'll then use the header function to set the authorization header, and as the value, we'll set the API key, and call the build function and chain it with map error to return a NewsAPI error of async request failed. We will then get the response by using the client instances execute method and passing the request, which we can then await and then call the JSON method to convert it into NewsAPI response. This is again an async function, so we'll have to call await on this as well. And let's map the error again with NewsAPI error. And in order to use the JSON method on request, we'll have to update the request with the JSON feature. So this works now, and then we'll do the same thing as the last expression in the fetch method. So I'll just paste this here, and let's fix a couple of errors here. This should be NewsAPI error. And with that, our fetch async method is complete. So to make this an optional API, let's use the feature flag. So I'm gonna annotate it with the CFG feature attribute, and as its value, we're gonna name our feature, which is async. We will then also feature gate the import as well, and in cargo.toml, we'll declare a features section where we will define the async feature, and as its value, we will define the list of crates we depend on, which will be request. And looks like there is an error with the dependency, and the error is due to request not being declared as an optional dependency. So we're going to put the optional key as true. And there is also an error in the error variant declaration. So let's put the config feature async annotation there as well. And with that, our fetch async method implementation is done. So let's try to use the fetch async method back in main, and I'm going to rename this to fetch async. And looks like the compiler is not able to find the fetch async method, and this is because fetch async is hidden behind the async feature flag, which is not included by default because it's an optional feature. So let's add the async feature, and with that change, it should bring the fetch async method in scope. But you can see we have another error, which says that the question mark operator cannot be applied to fetch async method. And this is because fetch async does not return a result type, but instead returns something called an impl future, which in simpler terms means that it returns a type that is a future. Now, futures in Rust are conceptually identical to JavaScript promises, except for the fact that JavaScript tries to hide all the complexity of executing promises in the background. But since we're using Rust, it's a compile time language without a garbage collector, and which means that we need to be explicit in how we execute our futures. And async functions in Rust can only be executed within async context. And in order to execute async functions, we will need to suffix them with the await keyword. And even this won't work because await can only be called from within async blocks or an async function. So let's try to do what the compiler says, and let's put async before the main function, and this will lead us into a quite confusing error which says that main function is not allowed to be async. In order to make the main function async, we'll have to introduce a top level executor that runs the main async block for us, and there are async executors in Rust that lets you run async function. So the most popular of them is Tokio. Then you have the async std framework, and then you also have the small crate that provides a similar API. We're going to use Tokio because it's the most popular. So let's add the Tokio crate, and we're going to go to our cargo.toml and update the dependency to include the full feature so that we can use Tokio's handy main attribute macro. And what this will do is mark the main function as the top level async function, which Tokio will run within its async task executor. So with that change, we can now use the question mark operator and then extract the NewsAPI response, which is then passed to render articles. So with those changes, we are finally done with our refactor, and let's take the CLI news for a spin just so we make sure that everything works as before. Let's do cargo run. Awesome. So that's all we had for this video. I hope you learned something new. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.